Hi guys, so for today's lesson we're going to be talking about something very important in the field of biology, and that is genotypes and phenotypes. This is important because it deals with every living thing, whether it be plants, animals, or humans. It helps us understand why we look the way we do, why we get certain diseases, and why we act certain ways. The first thing we're going to do is focus on our goal for the day. So by the end of this class, we, the students, you guys, will understand the idea of genotypes and phenotypes and be able to apply and demonstrate that knowledge in real-life genetics through an in-class video step-by-step activity and an individual test-yourself quiz. Now, let's dive right in. So the first thing we need to understand is what a genotype is and what a phenotype is. So a genotype refers to the genetic code that's in every individual, and it's in our individual cells. This code tells us what our body is going to end up looking like, what kind of diseases we're more likely to have, in some cases why we act the way we act. So all these things are coded in our cells through our genotype. That genotype doesn't necessarily have to be seen to the naked eye or even expressed in our actions, but it still exists. For example, you can be a carrier for a disease, but not actually experience that disease carried out. This leads to our next topic, which is phenotypes. That is how we see each other. That is the genetic code expressed. So our phenotype would be, for example, if I see one of you guys has brown hair. That brown hair is the expression of that genotype, and that is your phenotype. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of Mendel and his study of different pea flowers and the colors that happen over generations. So, as we mentioned before, genotype is the code within our cells, and that is expressed by a set of alleles. So, the set of alleles that an individual has are denoted by an uppercase letter and a lowercase letter. That uppercase letter denotes the dominant allele, while the lowercase letter expresses the recessive allele. Now, let's take a look at these plants. So, as we can see here, phenotype would be whether the flower is purple or white. Genotype would be the alleles that code for that expression. So, when we look at the flower to the naked eye, we see that 3 of these flowers end up being purple. So, 3 out of the 4, in this case, are bred and come out as purple, while only one comes out as white. Now, the genotypes that code for these are a little different. So let's take a look. For the first purple plant, it's denoted by 2 capital P's, which means 2 dominant alleles, and this would be homozygous. Homo meaning same, and zygous meaning the 2 alleles would be the same. So heterozygous would mean 2 different ones. And in this case, as we can see, a capital P, which would be dominant, and a recessive P, which would be lowercase, come together to make heterozygous. But it's expressed as purple, the same as the previous homozygous one. This is because the dominant allele tends to mask the recessive one, and the dominant one is the one that gets expressed into a phenotype. This is repeated again in the next flower beneath it. However, when we examine this one, which is homozygous recessive, denoted by 2 lowercase p's, we see that that codes for white. This code right here, the 2 lowercase p's, 2 recessive alleles, is the only way in this specific example to get a white flower. Now let's keep that in mind. However, when we talk about these ratios, we wonder how they come to be, and that is what we'll go into next. So this is called a Punnett square, and it helps us see the outcome of 2 different pairs of alleles. So, for example, let's say you have a mom and she carries a capital B and a lowercase b, and a dad who carries a capital B and a lowercase b, which, by the way, would mean both of them are heterozygous. Let's take a look at what these alleles would give us. So if we want to figure it out, we do it almost as a multiplication table. So we have a capital B and a capital B. This would give us 2 capital B's, which is homozygous, dominant. Now, here we would have a capital B and a lowercase b, which is heterozygous. Here would be capital B, lowercase b, which would also be heterozygous. And here would be two lowercase b's. This would give us the same reference as we saw here in the P-planes, a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. 1 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygous, and 1 homozygous recessive. That is how we ended up with those flowers to the side. Now, using this knowledge, this can be applied to our daily lives. So a parent and another parent, a mother and a father, come together and they have 4 kids. These are the chances of the 4 kids and how they will come out. Let's say a dominant homozygous B would mean black hair, and a homozygous recessive would mean blonde hair. And let's say heterozygous would be brown hair, just giving random traits here. We would end up with 1 child with black hair, 1 with blonde hair, and 2 with brown hair. Obviously, genetics works a little different when it comes to hair color, but you get the gist. Now, let's go on to this. We're going to do an activity together. It shouldn't take much of your time, but if you do it correctly, you'll understand the concepts that we've done today, and in turn, we'll do it step by step. So here you have these 2 dolls, and you can either draw it yourself on a paper or print out from the online website these 2 reference points. So let's begin. Each activity will talk about a different trait, and we'll go over each one of these questions, and in turn, you will end up with a trait that you will put on that doll. So the first one, we know that a capital B means brown eyes, and a lowercase b means blue eyes. A baby is born with a genotype with 2 capital B's. Now, what does that mean? What is the genotype? The genotype, obviously because it's 2 of the same thing, we already know that that means it's homozygous. And because the 2 B's are capital, we know that a capital denotes dominant. So that would be homozygous dominant. The genotype would be homozygous dominant. However, when we look at the phenotype, we know that the dominant one is brown eyes. And since here we have 2 dominant alleles, the question is answered simply. We would end up with brown eyes. So if that's what you guys got for the first step, draw some brown eyes on that doll. Next one, let's talk about dimples. So denoted by a capital D is the trait of dimples, and a lowercase d, the absence of dimples. So we have a baby that's born with a capital D and a lower d. What is that genotype? So since it's a mix of a dominant and a recessive, it cannot be homozygous since it's not 2 of the same allele. That leads us to our final decision, meaning it will be heterozygous. Now with that, we need to wonder, what is the phenotype going to be? Since capital D, dominant, would mean dimples, and lowercase d, recessive, means no dimples, and we have a mix of the 2, what can we assume? We would assume that there would be dimples present. And this is because the dominant allele, the capital D, always masks the recessive one. So even though there is a recessive allele present, the one that gets expressed is the dominant one. Now, for the last question, I want you guys to do this as a little quiz on your own. Feel free to pause this video right now, take a look at the question, and see if you can work it out on your own. I'll give you a second to do that. Alright guys, well, welcome back, and let's go over the explanation to this question. So just as we've tested out the 2 previous questions, the capital T means dominant, lowercase means recessive. In this case, capital T stands for tall, and lowercase t will mean short. So a pea plant has the genotype capital T and a lowercase t. Which trait is dominant, tall or short? Kind of gave you the answer already. A dominant trait is denoted by a capital letter. So we can see here that the capital T, which means tall, would be our dominant trait. So the dominant trait would be tall. The second question asks, is the pea plant homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous? Since there is a mix of 2 different types of alleles, both a dominant capital T and a recessive lowercase t, we see that the trait would be heterozygous. And lastly, what will its phenotype be? Since there is a capital and a lowercase, and it is heterozygous, the trait that will be expressed will be a tall P point, and this is because, just as in our last example, the dominant allele masks the recessive one. I hope you guys did great on this mini quiz that you tested yourself on, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and we will be applying even more of this in our next week's study. See you then.